Welcome to all to this webinar convened by the World Obesity Federation and the Global Alliance for the Future on Food on obesity, COVID-19 and food systems, collective action for a healthy recovery. Great that so many hundreds of people could join us today. So moving on to the next slide, I'd like to just start very quickly by saying that this webinar will be recorded, that there will be a chance to ask questions during the Q&A sessions, and we'd ask you to ask questions of the speakers and post comments and questions as they come to you in the Q&A function. It will be recorded, and the recording slides, feedback form and certificate of attendance will be circulated post-event. Next. So my name is Professor Corinna Hawkes. I'm Director of the Centre for Food Policy at City University of London, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar today. And in this webinar, I really welcome the coming together of two challenges of profound global importance in our world today: obesity and food systems. And despite the human tragedy of the coronavirus, one of the positive things it has done is to open up the spaces for these kinds of conversations and to think and act more deeply about how these kinds of major challenges are actually connected. There are so many systems that are impacted by COVID-19, the health systems, environmental systems, economic systems, and of course the food system, and all of those systems interconnect. And what has become sadly apparent is that ultimately the food system has made us all more vulnerable to COVID-19 by shaping food environments that stimulate the consumption of obesogenic diets, also associated with diet-related non-communicable diseases. The evidence is clear that these conditions increase the risk of complications from COVID-19. But in turn, of course, the coronavirus has impacted heavily on the functioning of the food system, as well as the economic status of households, which is now raising high levels of concern of an impending crisis of undernutrition. And both of these crises indicate that food systems need to be fundamentally reoriented towards health. And all of these issues will be covered by our speakers in this webinar today. Next. So the first part of the agenda will be two presentations. The first on the impact of COVID-19 on global nutrition and food systems goals, and second, an overview of the global syndemic and implications of COVID-19. And following from that, next, in the second part, we'll have an introduction to the Global Alliance for the Future of Food and its food health narrative, with a panel discussion with cases from China, Rwanda, and the United States. So it's really fantastic to bring together two organizations who haven't historically worked together on these crucial issues to show how they link. Next. So the first part, the overview, next please, will be led by two presentations by Dr. Nancy Alberto and Dr. Bill Dietz. Dr. Nancy Alberto is the Deputy Director of the Nutrition and Food Systems Division of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. And following Nancy, we'll hear from Dr. Bill Dietz, Chair of the Red Zone Global Center for Prevention and Wellness at the George Washington University in the United States. First, Nancy, over to you.
Thank you, Corinna. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. I'm really pleased to be here today. It's such an excellent opportunity to share with you some learnings that we at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations have learned from the impacts of COVID-19 on nutrition and food systems. Next. Before the arrival of COVID, the world was already struggling to make progress for the global nutrition-related goals of Agenda 2030 and the aims of zero hunger. Though, of course, we have made some progress, for example, reducing stunting and wasting in young children, that progress has been too slow. Furthermore, hunger and food insecurity are still alarmingly high. And as I imagine this audience today knows all too well, the public health crisis of overweight and obesity continues to grow. Next. And what makes our pre-COVID context even more challenging is the burden of multiple forms of malnutrition existing simultaneously. This map, published in the recently released Global Nutrition Report, shows not only the pervasiveness of obesity around the globe, but also the number of countries, those here in grays and orange, that struggle with the coexistence of multiple nutritional problems simultaneously. I'd like also to point out to you that many of these countries that report overweight as a form of malnutrition of public health significance, next, are also countries requiring external food assistance, meaning that they lack the resources to deal with critical problems of food insecurity, thus highlighting the interconnectedness of the world in which we live, our food systems, and the complexity of nutritional problems. Next. So with this backdrop, we are now faced with the global public health crisis of COVID-19. And though initially it was focused as a health crisis, the pandemic is also challenging our food security and nutrition through impacts on the physical functioning of the food systems and through massive economic effects at both the micro and the macro levels. And in both cases, it's high-value commodities, such as fruits and vegetables, meat, milk and dairy, and fish, all important for healthy diets, which are most vulnerable. Next. So to think through how to respond, I find it helpful to consider conceptually how food systems are structured and how they work. Many of you have likely seen this before. It's a framework that I like to use from the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition that depicts three main components: food supply chains, food environments, and consumer behavior that influence diet. It's dietary quality, quantity, diversity, and safety. And diets, in turn, ultimately affect nutrition and health outcomes. Of course, we all recognize that nutrition and health outcomes are influenced by many other factors, but healthy diets are indeed a prerequisite to good nutrition. So how has COVID impacted this food system, and how are we responding? Next. Starting with food supply chains. So far, globally, the supply and the price of key staples, such as wheat, maize, rice, and soybean, have remained relatively stable. In fact, the Food Outlook, a biannual report on global food markets, which was just released last week, predicts that global cereal stocks will actually expand in 2020-2021 compared to the previous biennium. And though it's not as easy to predict globally where we are and where we will be with fruits and vegetables, meat, dairy, and other fresh foods, indications are not as optimistic as for staples. Labor shortages have reportedly affected harvest and planting. Processing and packing has been adversely impacted, and traders and distributors of perishables have been hit particularly hard by restrictions of movement. Next. For example, in the country of Libya, the land crossing with Tunisia has been closed sporadically throughout the duration of the pandemic, which has led to price spikes in fresh foods across that country. In the United States, herds of animals have had to be culled because of the lack of ability to process due to plant closures. And similarly, in India, there have been reports documenting the dumping of thousands of gallons of milk per day because of an inability of farmers to distribute their milk. To mitigate the negative effects of the responses to COVID, and indeed what we're discussing here are the responses to the COVID itself, FAO has advocated on the global stage for improved efficiency of trade and movement of food, even while other transport is restricted. FAO is also promoting e-commerce and other innovations for linking supply with demand when traditional supply chains are disrupted, such as linking farmers directly with food banks in need. Next. So moving on to the food environments. In addition to the knock-on effects of the supply chain's challenges, the closure of schools and markets and the restriction of personal movements have also impacted the physical access to food. However, perhaps even more worrisome, perhaps most worrisome indeed, is the profound impact the pandemic is having on economic access to food. in addition to the millions of people who are out of work. Unlike the relatively stable price of staple grains, the price of fresh food appears to be increasing. On this slide, you see a graph that shows the average global price of a few select fresh items, indicated as a percentage change from the mid-February to today. And these increases are ranging from 2.5% to 10%. Next slide, please. So in regards to physical access, some examples to highlight. In the country of Sao Tome and Principe, those living outside of the capital were restricted from entering the city due to fear of disease transmission. However, fresh and wet markets are concentrated in the capital city, and therefore this response was effectively cutting the population off from its fresh food supply. Around the globe, countries have closed schools, meaning that more than 350 million school children are not receiving meals in schools, an important source of nutrition for many. So local authorities in Sao Tome and Principe and many other countries are starting to open up alternative markets outside of the capital to support both the producers who now can continue to sell and consumers who now have access to fresh food. And FAO is very active at the global and the national level, working with a number of partners, including some UN sister agencies, namely UNICEF and the World Food Program, UNESCO, in providing guidance and policy and program support for alternative mechanisms to provide healthy school meals while schools aren't in session. Now, the discussion of economic access links with the next part of the food system. Next slide, please. And that is consumer behavior. First and foremost, reduced purchasing power results in buying less food or less expensive foods, which in many contexts means buying more starchy staples and highly processed foods, which are oftentimes high in fat, sugar, and salt. Reduced purchasing power also results in greater utilization of food banks where available. Other common reactions to the pandemic that are affecting consumer behavior are fear of a food supply depletion resulting in stockpiling of food and supplies, and a desire to reduce physical interaction with others, leading to buying more highly processed, long shelf life foods. Next. For example, there have been many reports from across the United States, the United Kingdom, and many other countries of consumers stockpiling foods to such a degree that the shelves in the supermarkets are bare, inciting even more fear of food supply shutdowns. In Italy, at the beginning of the lockdown, there were reports documenting a significant increase in the sale of a number of different canned long life items. And the European Food Banks Federation has reported a 25 to 30% increase in the use of food banks across European Union countries. FAO has been working with partners to actively message that food supplies, for the most part, are not in danger of exhaustion, and that shelves are bare in places like the US and the UK because of a just-in-time supply chain strategy. While we're also working with governments on mitigation measures to ensure that supply chains do indeed continue to function well in all contexts. FAO has also been working on a number of fronts to help combat the economic challenges. For example, ensuring social protection programs are nutrition sensitive, including support to food banks and cash and voucher programs, so that consumers can continue to have choices that can support a healthy diet. We're also advocating for tax and trade policies that can stabilize supply and price of foods needed for a healthy diet. Next slide, please. As of yet, there is not a great deal of empirical evidence on the impact of the pandemic on diet and nutrition outcome. There are a few isolated reports, particularly from the Central African Republic and Afghanistan, which have indeed documented increases in food insecurity. However, even though as of yet we don't have empirical evidence on the nutrition outcomes, it's easy to see with these challenges across the food system, the risk to the quality, quantity, and diversity of diets. And without concerted, coordinated, and urgent action, we will indeed see negative impacts on nutrition, and we may even see a nutrition crisis. Next. So in summary, the FAO and partners are working globally in support of the priorities articulated in the United Nations Secretary General's policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on food systems and nutrition, namely saving lives and livelihoods, strengthening social protection systems for nutrition, and finally, leveraging this moment where both the strengths and the weaknesses across the food system have been highlighted to invest in a sustainable future, to use this moment of crisis that has forced change in our lives to collectively innovate for a stronger, better functioning food system that supports human and planetary health now and for generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nancy. That was fascinating to hear the role of FAO and the analysis that you presented there, and really highlighting the role of the importance of a high quality diet, making them available and affordable, and how important that is to link nutrition, food systems and obesity, and how strengthening food systems is really needed to underpin moving forward. So now I'd like to move on and introduce Bill Dietz. Bill, over to you.
Great, thank you, Corinna. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and particularly to be part of this partnership between the Global Alliance for the Future of Food and the World Obesity Federation. I'm going to talk today about the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change, and the more recent syndemic of COVID-19, undernutrition, or food insecurity and obesity. These are all pandemics. We're labeling climate change as a pandemic. And syndemics come from the combination of the words synergy and epidemics. And in this case, we're talking about the synergy of pandemics. Syndemics are pandemics that occur in the same time and place and have negative effects on each other. They are driven by cultural, social, and economic drivers. Next, our work in this area began with the Lancet report on the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. And I want to walk you through this as kind of a preface to the COVID-19. So the outcomes are shown in this block on the right, and these reflect a number of interactions. For example, climate change, increased greenhouse gases, decreased crop production or crop yields, and also affect the micronutrient composition of crops. This contributes to undernutrition and food insecurity. There's an interaction between obesity and undernutrition in the same families and often in the same children who are affected by both obesity and stunting. Car use, for example, increases greenhouse gases, therefore contributing to climate change and its effects on crop production and undernutrition. But it also decreases in the physical activity, increase the likelihood of obesity. Similarly, beef production, which has an adverse effect on obesity and also causes cardiovascular disease and colon cancer, is associated with increased greenhouse gases from cattle production, which also contribute to the consequences of climate change on crop production and micronutrient malnutrition. So these are the interacting pandemics that constitute the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. Next. These factors, these elements, these pandemics are driven by systems, and these are well known to you, the food and agriculture system, but also the transport, land use, and urban design systems, which contribute to the car use and lack of physical activity from walking. But these systems in turn are driven by, next, the deeper drivers of power, policies, economics, and social norms. And these offer a choice. We can focus on the outcomes, But the real change would need to begin on the far left. How do we change governance? How do we change these policies, economics, and social norms? And those are very significant challenges. But one of the benefits of this syndemic view is it provides the options of double or triple duty solutions that would affect both obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. Next. So COVID-19 has brought about a new syndemic, one that contributes to the existing syndemic, as shown here. So COVID-19 affects obesity. We know that people with obesity have an adverse course of COVID-19 infections with increased rates of hospitalization and mortality. We also know that people of color are disproportionately affected, and these reflect some of the social determinants of disease and the increase in chronic diseases in these populations, as well as the poor living conditions, underemployment, and access to foods. As Nancy pointed out, there is also an increase in ultra-processed food intake, and we know that's associated with obesity. And the lockdown has increased inactivity, which means that there's an increase in obesity. COVID-19 has also affected the likelihood of undernutrition. We know that rates of food insecurity have increased markedly in the United States. Food insecurity now affects 23 to 31% of adults and 28 to 37% of children and adolescents. So the impact of COVID-19 on undernutrition is substantial, and although we haven't yet seen frank undernutrition. The consequences of the lockdown are also in terms of lost wages, which means that people are food insecure, and as Nancy pointed out, more reliant on the emergency food systems. And finally, COVID-19 resulted from environmental degradation, the increased encroachment of human populations on the wild. Next slide. So the agricultural system is at the heart of much of this, and the workforce particularly has an increased rate of COVID-19 infections, particularly because of poor living conditions, overcrowding, poor nutrition, low wages, lack of personal protective equipment. As we well know, the problems in the workforce have affected dramatically the food supply chain. So recent estimates in an MMWR in the United States indicate that 10% of the workforce that works in these meat processing plants has been affected. And in some plants, up to 25% of the workforce has been affected. This has had a substantial impact on the food supply chain, not only from farm workers in the field, but also from decreased processing, decreased availability of foods, and decreased access to foods. Next. And that means that the workforce and the supply chain are now interacting substantially to increase the rates of obesity, the increased rates of insecurity. And these arrows are bidirectional because as this workforce is equally affected by COVID-19 infections and obesity and these other chronic diseases. And next. But the deeper drivers of these systems are things like immigration policy in the United States or structural racism, that the poor living conditions and poor nutrition and low wages have prioritized profit over health. And these, in fact, because so much of the workforce, of the essential workforce from farm to fork is our minority populations and essential workers, we are not treating them as essential workers. We've in fact created conditions that prioritize profit over health and sustain this agricultural system. So what are the potential solutions to this syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and COVID-19? Well, here are several, and I would invite lots of people to contribute to this because this is a preliminary way of thinking. But what are the triple duty solutions? Well, one is to stabilize the food supply chain. And one thought is building and strengthening local and regional and sustainable plant-based food systems. This has several benefits. We can expect that it would improve health of the food supply chain workforce, and which would in turn result in decreased COVID-19 infections. It would produce healthier diets for obesity and diabetes and climate change, and thereby decrease COVID-19 mortality. And the net effect of this chain would be to reduce SARS-CoV-2 exposures and improve nutrition, will also increase resistance to infection. Now, so this is a triple duty solution. I'm under no illusions that this is easy, but revising and changing the food chain to the food supply chain to make it healthier for people and the planet is a big lift. A second triple duty solution is improving worker conditions, housing, medical coverage, wages, and personal protective equipment. This will have the same effect in terms of improving the health of the food supply chain workforce, which would in turn decrease COVID-19 infections of that workforce. It would provide healthier diets for obesity and diabetes and decrease mortality, and would also improve nutrition and which would increase resistance to infection as the workforce is able to afford better food and better conditions. So in conclusion, I think seeing the COVID-19 obesity and undernutrition as a syndemic offers insights into the interactions of these systems. And they're certainly complex systems, but by viewing the interaction of these systems, we increase the likelihood that we can identify triple duty solutions that would address simultaneously obesity, undernutrition, and COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Again, another fascinating presentation, and really interesting to hear about the framework that has been developed there to look at these different interactions and how actually it's not just about looking at the shared causes, but looking at the shared solutions. So I'd now like to open up for 10 minutes of questions. If you'd like to post your questions into the Q&A, then I will pose them to Nancy and Bill. And I've been asked, so there's a question here about affordability of food. What's the view, and perhaps we can go to you, Nancy, about the ways that government, given food insecurity, and given what you said about it looks like the price of the healthier, the higher value food is actually going up faster. What are some feasible ways that FAO think governments can use to increase the affordability of healthy diets?
Thank you, Corinna. I think it's an excellent question without an easy answer. But in general, what FAO is working to do is to try to stabilize food supplies. And in stabilizing food supplies, you can stabilize food prices. What's happening, there's a lot of uncertainty in the markets. And this is affecting, as I noted in my presentation, it does affect those fresh foods to a much greater extent than staple crops, which we can already predict are going to be stable throughout the next 18 months. And so in trying to stabilize the food supply, working on support to policy and legislation and guidance around keeping transportation open so that farmers can get their products to markets. Working to ensure that markets, and it reflects some of what Bill was just noting in the importance of win-win situations, working so that markets don't become foci for COVID-19, but can remain active. So working to set up guidelines so that markets can allow for physical distancing and perhaps have extended hours, and a number of different things have been tried. Having, like in Sao Tome and Principe, having fewer smaller markets, things that allow products to continue to be sold. Other things that have been done is supporting small producers in a lot of countries around the world, especially throughout Asia, Latin America, and the African continent. It's small and medium holders that produce the vast majority of the vitamins and minerals in our food supply, but they're also the producers that are the most vulnerable to shocks in the food system. So it's also working on bigger macroeconomic responses to allow those small producers to have access to loans to help stabilize their economic situation so they can maintain a production even when they have some challenges in their distribution, if it doesn't, if it doesn't cause them in their small production to collapse entirely. That can help stabilize the market as well. So there are a vast array of both micro and macro economic responses, and there's a lot that depends on the context of the country we're working in, the region we're working in, with also a global angle that helps keep everything as well in perspective in terms of knock-on effects from the impact of the actions that we're doing. Over.
I'll just add to that two things. One of the promises of local and regional food systems is that food may become less expensive. On the other hand, if we're really paying essential workers essential wages, the prices of those foods will go up. So it's a conundrum, unless we begin to address some of the issues that sustain inexpensive foods at the global level, and subsidies are a key element of that. And I think that's a good illustration of how these systems interconnect, and the need to not just consider a single solution without considering the broad other ramifications of those solutions.
Thanks both for those comprehensive responses. Building on that, there's a question here about food system resilience. You mentioned there about the local and regional food systems, Bill, and Nancy, you were talking in your presentation about building up local linkages. But there are some different views out there, and one of those is that actually the globalized, industrialized food system has been enormously resilient and has kept food on the shelves and kept foods on people's plates. And there's another view out there that talks about the importance of local and regional food systems and what they can deliver in a more resilient and sustainable manner. So do you have any views about what you think the evidence is really, and about the balance between supporting those two different types of food systems, if you like? Bill, perhaps you can start to briefly build on what you said, and then I'll go over to Nancy.
Right. Well, I think that's another question that needs further research and resolution. I don't think that in the immediate future it's going to be possible to go to a local and regional food system. However, that process could, if that process begins, we can begin, I think, to displace some of the reliance on the national food chains. And I would argue that the national food supply chain has not been particularly resilient. If one looks, for example, at beef production, I don't think we can call a system that affects up to 25% of workers with COVID-19 a particularly resilient system. And I don't think we can talk about the kind of culling that Nancy indicated that's been going on in the United States with respect to poultry, pork, and beef, and even dairy, a resilient system. I think the question and the challenge is, how do we construct a system that's a blend of both the reliance on the national food supply as well as the local and regional food supply?
Thank you, Bill. Anything to add to that, Nancy?
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree entirely. I think that it's finding the right blend. I don't think it's one or the other. As I noted, we already have identified 44 countries that are reliant on food assistance in the world, and those countries, by definition, have to have something beyond their borders to nourish their populations. And I will say that I think what Bill has highlighted in terms of the culling of the disease in the disease transmission within meat processing facilities, these are the weaknesses in the food system that have been highlighted. But I do think it is right to say that there are strengths that have come across as well. For example, the stability in grains and cereals. So I think it's good to keep an eye on those weaknesses and how can we respond to that, but also how can we build responses that leverage the strengths that are there as well.
And just one other thought, the beef production system is dependent on a high demand for beef. And another strategy that we need to consider and employ is how do we change demand to a more plant-based diet, which would displace beef and have all of the kind of knockdown effects on climate change.
Thank you. Well, now we've had wonderful questions here, and of course, no time to ask them all. And I need to pass over onto the next part of the webinar. But let me just ask one very question and ask for a one-line answer or a two-line answer, which is what would be the most useful thing the private sector could do, which of course makes up most of the food system, in addressing the challenges that you've laid out. Nancy.
The most important thing for the private sector to do is to realign their corporate goals to focus on putting people at the center as opposed to profit at the center.
Fantastic.
Yes, I would agree. I would agree with that, and I think there's also an opportunity for businesses to innovate, to establish a profitable business plan that is better for people and for the planet.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for answering those questions and your really insightful presentations. That was really a very rich session. So I'm now going to, thank you, Nancy, thank you, Bill. I'm now going to pass over to Ruth Richardson to introduce the Global Alliance. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Corinna, and I'm really pleased to be part of this webinar today. Hello, everybody. My name is Ruth Richardson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. The Global Alliance is a strategic alliance of 27 philanthropic foundations who are working together to address some of the critical issues we face today, like climate change, biodiversity loss, public health, workers' rights and protections, racial justice, and many other critical challenges. What brings them together in the Global Alliance is a belief in the centrality of food systems as both a root cause of these problems and, importantly, as a critical pathway to the solutions. All of our work is based on holistic systems perspective, built on 7 indivisible principles or outcomes that we see for food system transformation, such as equity, diversity, health, and resilience. We have 4 impact areas where we practically situate our work, and one of our priority areas is health and well-being. In that work, we are launching today a shared vision and narrative for global food systems that promotes human, ecological, and animal health and well-being in partnership with Tasting the Future. It's the result of a broad stakeholder-led engagement process that gathered insights and feedback from a really diverse array of individuals and organizations who work across the food health nexus within and across many contexts, scales, cultures, and geographies. And what it does is aims to foster more dialogue on the opportunities to accelerate the transformation of our food systems so that all food system actors can achieve health and sustainability goals through policy practice and new business models. So through this work, the shared narrative that was developed is essentially that the way food is processed, harvested, produced, distributed, marketed, eaten, and disposed of promotes human, ecological, and animal health and well-being, and that all actors actively shape and contribute to healthy, equitable, renewable, resilient, just, inclusive, and culturally diverse food systems. We argue that we need to change the prevailing narrative from the prevailing narrative aimed at feeding the world, which focuses on quantity of food and calories produced, based on assumptions that we need to double food production by 2050, maximizing yields based on models of food production with origins in the global north, need to be exported to the rest of the world. We need to move from that narrative to a new narrative that is centered on nourishing a growing population well, while ensuring human ecological and animal health and well-being. This new narrative focuses on the quality of food produced so that it contributes towards healthy, equitable, renewable, resilient, just, inclusive, and culturally diverse food systems, operating within environmental limits and addressing a range of social, cultural, and economic determinants of good health. To fully embrace this new narrative will mean challenging prevailing mainstream narratives and mindsets and transforming the physical, socioeconomic, and political contexts that shape food systems. It also means that we need tools such as true cost accounting as an approach to help health sector stakeholders understand the full direct and indirect costs and benefits of our food systems. This is very much in line with what Bill and Nancy were just talking about in terms of the cost of food. We need a more holistic, comprehensive, and inclusive framework that looks at what are the real costs of food in the food system. As part of this work, we're pulling together a variety of case studies that embody the key characteristics of food systems that prioritize human ecological and animal health and well-being. And we're really thrilled to have several brilliant leaders of these case studies with us today from China, Rwanda, and the USA to highlight these successful initiatives in the following panel discussion. I think you'll agree once you hear from these panelists that these examples help ground Corinna's discussion with Bill and Nancy in a way that helps us imagine what's possible and in a way that powerfully starts to build this new narrative. So let's now turn to this panel to help us kind of ground truth these issues. First, we have with us Solomon Makuza. Solomon is the Executive Director of Gardens for Health International, based in Rwanda. Gardens for Health is a nonprofit that provides long-lasting agricultural solutions to child malnutrition in Rwanda. GHI partners with health clinics in rural and peri-urban areas so that families facing malnutrition are equipped with a combination of seeds for crops, nutrition education, and peer support. Solomon has led community development strategy design and implementation at Partners in Health. He is an East African Acumen Fellow, an Aspen Health Scholar, and an African Visionary Fellow. Welcome, Solomon. So Solomon, my first question for you is, how is your local experience being shaped by global threats like obesity, climate, COVID? And how is your organization in turn shaping new solutions?
Thank you so much, Ruth, and greetings, everyone. It's such a delight and a pleasure to be part of this very important discussion. So the most notable similarity among all forms of malnutrition that we can all agree to it is the generally a lack of balanced, diverse diets and low consumption of fruits and vegetables. Evidence is clear, and it's been discussed that overweight and obesity is concerning and steeply rising across the globe, the continent, and Rwanda isn't immune. Currently, about 9.3% of women, have obesity, and 1.9% of men have also, been recorded as having obesity, whereas 8% of children below the age of 5 are overweight or obese. So we can see that Rwanda is experiencing a malnutrition burden with the young and adult populations. At Gardens for Health, our work has always been focused on raising awareness about good nutrition and providing agricultural support to facilitate vegetables production and diverse diets consumption at the household level. Although our target has always been rural, focused with the issues of undernutrition, COVID-19 has clearly demonstrated that it does not treat us equally. Undernourished people have weaker immune systems, and they may be at a greater risk of severe illnesses. At the same time, poor metabolic health, including obesity and diabetes, is strongly linked to worse COVID-19 outcomes. So as an organization, we see and accept a moral imperative. And with that, we have launched an initiative that targets communities that are at high risk of obesity or overweight with nutrition messaging availing healthy food products in partnership with digital marketplaces here in Rwanda, and we continue to learn. And as far as climate change is concerned, smallholder farmers who provide 80% of food supply and form a larger proportion of our target, unfortunately, have been hit the hardest. They experience firsthand the long dry spells, floods, increasing temperature, and changes in pests and diseases pressure. As a matter of fact, of recent, we saw a new pest at our trial farm that we have never seen before. In response to this, as an organization, we've taken an adaptive approach that focuses on A, sharing and learning from our communities, B, testing climate smart agricultural practices, and C, promoting the growth and consumption of traditional vegetables that have not always had a place of visibility, such as amaranth, cowpeas, African nightshade, to mention but a few, which provide much higher amounts of important minerals, and they are more resilient to climate change and can also easily adapt to local growth conditions. So it has been a learning curve, and we continue to work hand in hand with communities and the government of Rwanda to navigate these challenges. Thank you.
Fantastic, Solomon. You know, you are situated in a place where you really are seeing the sharp end of the negative aspects of the food system. And how they influence, as you mentioned, smallholder farmers, and I'm guessing mostly women, and especially marginalized communities. So given that, you know, the imperative becomes even stronger in terms of the desperate need for change in the food system. And you mentioned messaging. And I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit more about this. I noticed on your website that you talked about, there's a quote there that says, "We believe in changing systems, not treating symptoms." And I'm just wondering, what is the importance for you and your work on kind of the messaging, the new narratives, and the communication of these narratives to the communities that you serve? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So our organization's existence was inspired by a number of stories. And one of them that I'm reminded of is of a young, beautiful baby girl called Phoebe, who was 9 years old and only weighed 29 pounds. At the hospital, she received the emergency food aid and the medical care that she desperately needed. However, this was only a short-term fix, and the grassroots causes of her malnutrition remained. And these causes included, but were not limited to, socioeconomic factors, household food insecurity, inadequate care and feeding practices, and unhealthy household environment. So all this really inspired us to work with children and health clinics. And as a result, we designed a program that provides nutrition education and agricultural support for households to grow and consume foods from their own background. Now, at Guidance for Health, the simple concept that food in itself does not equal good nutrition is at the heart of our mission. If you look around, and you know, statistics do show, as I mentioned earlier, that 80% of the farmland and food supply, you know, belong to smallholder farmers, and unfortunately, they themselves and their families are the ones that are affected or they are at risk of malnutrition. We've seen the messaging and a paradigm shift in how food systems being an essential element that needs to be, you know, given attention and even resourced. We strongly believe that you know, systems should do more than feeding populations and rather nourish them. As this you know, would be easier said than done, but this requires, you know, moving from an emphasis on the quantity of production to quality of the produce. There's a need of emphasizing on diverse and healthy diets rather than focusing on stable food crops. And there's also a need of targeting the supply side interventions to focus on both demand and supply. So messaging, you know, has and still plays a key role in the interest of informing consumer choices on the nutrition benefits of foods, and also supporting the supply side to ensure that you know, there's food availability that is and also accessibility that addresses the malnutrition burdens that we are discussing here today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Solomon. The power of stories. I really appreciate your perspective and having you share your experience and expertise with us today. If you have questions for Solomon, please make sure to put them in the Q&A box. And in the meantime, we'll go to our second panelist. We have with us Dr. Xiyan. Xiyan is the founder and executive director of Second Harvest in Beijing, which is a pioneering approach to expand access to food growing spaces and local produce for urban dwellers in China. She co-founded China's very first community supported agriculture project, or CSA, farm in China called Little Donkey Farm, growing and distributing organic vegetables to city consumers and renting plots of land to city folks interested in getting their hands dirty. Since then, thousands of similar CSA farms have opened up across China. She has been inspiring a healthier and more sustainable way to feed China. She is a pioneering force and active promoter behind the Chinese organic CSA movement. And she's now also the co-president of the international CSA network called Urgency, and has been selected as one of the young global leaders in 2016 by World Economic Forum, and one of 20 young influencers under 40 by Food Tank. So welcome, Xiyan. Xiyan, I'd like to ask you the same question to start out with, which is, how is your local experience being shaped by global threats like obesity, climate, COVID, and other threats? And how is your organization in turn shaping new solutions?
Hi, Ruth. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. Actually, I think now is a moment, in Beijing, we just experienced another wave of COVID-19. It's just this wave of this pandemic was happened in a wholesale market called Xinfadi wholesale markets. Is actually this market's 70% of the fresh vegetables directly from this wholesale markets. So 1 month ago, when it happened that salmon, some of the virus come from the kind of the sea fish area, and in one day, all the people, nearly all the people living in Beijing are quite worried about where where can they still get the vegetables or other food safely. So everyone in that day are rushing to the supermarket and looking for, even for the e-commerce. In China now, all the online shopping markets are very kind of popular. So so except when people are facing that challenge, also many people are going to the CSAs. CSA is short for Community Supported Agriculture. It's a kind of a way that connect directly from with the consumers, with the farmers. So as Share Harvest Farm, that day we also experienced a very high kind of rush of many people coming to us to asking if we can they can still make some orders. So I think it's a time that people are rethinking, how if we facing the challenge another 15 years later, or maybe 20 years later, how we can be more resilient in a food system when a local all the markets are so centralized, and how we can reconnect with the local farmers, or health and trust, how we can get the trustable food from the local markets or from local farmers. I think this also in average, because we as a CSA network China, we also kind of calculate our national CSAs when facing this challenge, this COVID challenge. most of the CSAs, their orders are increased 30% more. So it's a I think this time people are trying to increase their consumption by healthy food. So so CSAs is a way that it's a local based. It's also a solidarity based economic, and also it's a relationship between consumers and farmers.
Great, thank you, Xian. You talked a lot about the connection between consumption and production, which I think is absolutely essential, and it's one of the things that's sort of been missing in some of the debates around healthy diets, is how we really bring that back to what food we're producing, where and how and when and with who and what. So I really appreciate you making those links. I'm just actually looking at some of the questions in the chat box, and one of the things I wanted to ask, especially on the consumption side, is it seems that particularly in light of COVID, that there are a lot of questions around how do we ensure that people are eating healthy food in the midst of a pandemic, and particularly more vulnerable communities. Do you have experience with that in China, and do you have any suggestions on what the mechanisms might be, whether it's policy or working with state actors, or whether it's communications, working directly with communities? What ideas and suggestions do you have about ensuring that people are getting nutritious food in the light of a global pandemic?
I think when this pandemic, when it firstly happened, it's during the Spring Festival. Actually, each year, all the people are going back before the Spring Festival to their hometown. I think rural areas in China is a kind of mechanism that is kind of like a pond that it can, when every year when lots of immigrant workers, when they go into the city to work for the whole year, and before the Spring New Year, they go back to their hometown. So they, I think it's luckily it's kind of the COVID started in China, in Wuhan, kind of during that area, and not luckily, but if all the people are still crowding in the cities, I think it may be have more problems with the food, access to food, and people need to also pay more rents for housing in the cities. But when most of the people, they already go back to the hometown and they stay, if especially in the rural areas, people have their own land, their own housing, and they can grow some simple vegetables they need. So they are not depending on the city food system. So it's very kind of when the rural areas is a kind of a low cost living kind of lifestyle. So I think if we need to really, because recent years China just our central government proposed a national strategy called Rural Regeneration National Strategy, and this strategy really focus on how we can build the rural areas and the farming also as a mechanism to make our whole society more resilient to economic crisis or like COVID or some other maybe some other issues.
Great, and I wanted to move on to our final panel, but I do just have one more question for you, if it's okay. You are in touch with so many people that are trying to build a more resilient food system out in the rural regions. And as you talk to farmers, as you talk to people about the opportunities, what are they saying? What are their challenges? What are their questions? You know, what do they feel is inspiring about this? Can you just give us a bit of a flavor of some of the conversations you've had with the folks that you're interacting with in your work?
You mean the during this epidemic or
just generally, you know, as you go out and work with farmers and you're encouraging the uptake of more local production and the CSA model, do they have questions they're struggling with? Do they get really excited? What's the flavor, you know, in terms of how people are responding to your work?
I just want to tell one very short story. Actually, when I first started my farm in a local village in near Beijing area, you know, the farmer who is the indigenous farmers living in my village, elder farmer, he always kind of talking with me, like joking and saying kind of I'm crazy, you know, as a young people going back to the countryside and doing no fertilizer, no pesticide. But just 2 weeks ago, he comes to me and he asked me if I can give him a seedling of my farm tomato, because he got some tomatoes from my farm maybe some weeks ago, and he feels it's the best tomato he ever had. So he wants the seedling and he wants to grow that in his own small plots. I think it's an interesting change, although you know, it's quite a few years this change happened, but I'm happy to see, you know, it's started by the seeds and you know, growing, become you know, something rooted even in a village.
Yes, that's a fantastic story. Thank you, Xian. And you'll have to add to your list of accomplishments, the best tomato grower in China. Great. Okay, so we're going to go to our final panelist, Paula Daniels. Paula is the chair of the board of the Center of Good Food Purchasing. The Center for Good Food Purchasing uses the power of procurement to create a transparent and equitable food system that prioritizes the health and well-being of people, animals, and the environment through the nationally networked adoption and implementation of the Good Food Purchasing Program by large institutions. There are now 32 institutions in 15 cities across the US enrolled in this program, which received a 2018 Future Policy Award from the World Future Council, UN FAO, and the IFOAM Organics International. So welcome, Paula. And again, I'm going to start with the same question. You're situated in the US and hail from Hawaii. So how is your local experience being shaped by global threats like obesity, climate, and COVID? And how is your organization in terms shaping new solutions?
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. And I'm happy to be here. And I'm also pleased to report that since we I founded this organization with my colleague, Alexa Delwich, 5 years ago, we're now in 20 cities around the US and almost 50 institutions. So the number's grown over time. And we founded it coming out of another organization I founded called the Los Angeles Food Policy Council, which was founded in recognition of these very issues that have been highlighted so well by Bill Dietz and others, that the globalized food system has its impacts, definitely that were not the originally intended consequences, but are now the consequences of a very economic system. And the US, as many know, has very diverse aspects to it. And within many cities, within many regions, there are areas of persistent poverty and intractable issues with health and the issues of obesity. And I am part Hawaiian, and the Native Hawaiian population has a very high incidence of cardiometabolic disorder, largely related, you know, to a number of issues. Some of it is related to the disenfranchisement of being, you know, dispossessed in their own country, some historical legacy, political legacy, but also a consequence of the way the food system works and the displacement from their own ability to provide their own food. That there had been subsistence farming, and then they became dependent on a very commercialized food system, which we've heard about. So in recognition of all of this, in recognition of the loss of farmland, the economic peril to farmers, to the low payment. The fact that food is cheap is because wages are very low, in some instances almost to slave levels with workers. So how do you fix that system? And it's an economic system. We had created, it's largely an economic system. We created a program now called the Good Food Purchasing Program, which recognizes the value of public dollars, that you can use the purchasing power of large public institutions, particularly school districts, which are a number of our institutions, in shaping a more regional food system. So directing their, in some instances, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. In Los Angeles, they had a $150 million food budget. So we developed a tool that provides, it's a program that is, you could look at as a tool that provides a feedback and rating system to institutions, directing their purchases toward 5 integrated values: support for local economies, including smallholder farms and disadvantaged populations, support for environmental sustainable food production, because we recognize the impacts of the food on climate and other impacts as well, natural resource impacts, support for fair labor in the food system along the food supply chain, support, of course, for animal welfare, and then significantly also for nutritional health. So we have a rubric that has a number of standards within that, and purchasing goals and minimal baseline targets. We evaluate the purchasing of these large institutions and let them know how they're doing. So in aggregate, we have over $1 billion worth of purchasing that we're analyzing, and are pleased to report that it is being directed in ways that improve the environment, that support the local economy, and have created well-paying jobs as well. So that's how our work is directed now. And we are seeing some change in these regions, but we do agree that, and we see this as a way to start creating a more regionalized food system. And while it may not immediately be one that is replacing the globalized food system, if we look at it as having a significant and meaningful percent of change, we can start making a difference. I'll give you an example there. You know, if you think of food as a public good, and I think we're beginning to recognize that even more. There's some recognition of it because we have recognized agricultural production as a public good, and our country has poured support into agricultural production. And there's certainly a lot of debate about whether it's going in the right direction, but that's what we've done in the past. We also recognize the public health interest in food and have provided support for access to food through our supplemental nutritional assistance program. Again, more can be done in that direction. But what we haven't provided as much support for is the equitable distribution of food. So that's an area where we're recognizing, particularly during this pandemic, where due to the shutdown in food service, those supply chains were disrupted. And those are economic supply chains. They had to, over the course of a few months, rework themselves and pivot. Where you had more of a concerted public interest perspective on distribution of food, they were able to pivot more quickly. And some examples are some mission-driven food hubs that aggregate from smaller scale farmers and distribute to communities of need that have relationships at their core versus profit at their core. So moving more in that direction, I would say, recognizes the public good, the public interest in food, in a way that might bring it more in line with how we recognize the public interest in access to energy and access to water.
Yeah. So, Paula, you mentioned that you're already growing, you know, the numbers that I quoted were incorrect because you're already expanding. And there's so many examples of positive food system change that have shaped policy and practice in the right direction. And obviously your initiative is one of them, as well as Solomon's and Xi'an's. In light of these positive examples, many argue that for true systems change, we need to scale these initiatives. So given where you're situated and your growing organization, what does scaling mean to you, and how do we amplify, spread, and connect what's working well?
Yeah, I think scale, you know, I think moving from a notion of scale in a monolithic fashion, like one system becomes very large, I think scale can happen with diversity. And I think in particular, in an area like this, it can happen on a network basis. So our theory of change is to work with local governments and local municipal institutions, but to create scale within their region, and then also connect these regions with each other. And then you have a best practices scale. Even though like your sourcing is going to be from within your region, and it will be particular to your region, you will have a network of scale that shares best practices, contracting practices, infrastructure best practices, economic development best practices, workforce best practices, those sorts of things that will create a scale. I'm going to give you another analogy to the energy system. When there was an attempt to create a more renewable energy market back in the 70s, our president, then Jimmy Carter, had made that attempt. It was attempted to be in the federal system, which didn't work for a number of reasons as well. In the 21st century, cities, regions started participating in that idea and creating renewable portfolio standards, making their own regional targets, looking at their own regional array of energy. In some places it's geothermal, in some places it's more solar, in some places it's wind. So whatever their array is, and they set their own targets. And so those regional targets eventually became an internationally scaled change in renewable energy. Solar, while it was particular to a certain region, now has an international force. So I see scale happening in that way, so in a networked way. While for the food system, obviously, it's going to be what you do within your system. There's a lot that can be shared along those lines. And when I want to mention some other recognition of a similar idea through the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which has over 200 cities around the world signed on to their pact, which has, among other things, support for the idea of using public purchasing power in the way that I described to start making changes in the region. But these mayors of over 200 cities around the world are sharing best practices and agreeing to make these changes. So once you make those changes, you start impacting the entire food system and all the actors along the way, in particular because the larger food service providers and distributors are going to start responding to this network that's asking for the same thing, for food that is more supportive of health, of equity, and of the planet.
Great, thank you, Paula. Very exciting, and the work that you're doing is critically important. And I know that I've read lots of other pieces and heard other people talk about the power of procurement, and so you're sort of in the thick of that, which is fantastic. So I want to open it up to the full panel, and we've got some questions coming in. I think maybe to start with, it occurs to me that one of the big questions that each of you have spoken about, and even Bill and Nancy, is the need for kind of local, regional food systems, local, regional production and markets. Nancy said there needs to be a blend, of course, of different kinds and scales of food systems. But this has come up in all of your presentations. I see it's come up in many of the comments, either directly or indirectly, in terms of how do we feed people locally and nutritiously, particularly in the light of these challenges. Agnes Kalibata, who's the special envoy for the Food Systems Summit that's been named by the UN Secretary General, also came out with this as a recommendation that we need to support, short supply chains. It's coming up in so many different places. And I think especially in the light of COVID, recognizing the fragility of big food systems, big, long supply chains, people are kind of gravitating towards these sort of more local supply chains. So I just want to come at that again and say, like, how important is that to nutrition? How is that important to food security? And how do we really support that? I want to go back to Bill's question too about, not question, but his point about power and needing to get at the power dynamics through policies, governance, economics, social norms. So what's holding us back from really developing robust, resilient local systems, and how do we really advance them in a much faster and more effective way? So Solomon, maybe I can start with you and get your thoughts on that.
Sure, that's an excellent question. I do think that, I mean, if we look at, statistics really tell us that, again, as I mentioned, like 80% of the smallholder farmers, by the way, of which 80% of them are women, they, own farmlands, and they are the ones who contribute to the food supply, chain. And I think that is not only unacceptable, but it's also really unfair to have, these people who are doing all the hard work on the sidelines. I do think that there's value in, having them really, be at the epicenter of all the, food system design that, that we are being that are being discussed. I think that one of the challenges has been, the operational or the programs or interventions that operate in silos. Where food and nutrition and agriculture, in some ways, they've been operated separately in parallel with no, sync and links that brings, everything together, and that really is. Spoken to by the fact that you see 80% of, the farmers, and then you see about 38% in the case of Rwanda, of children who are malnourished. So that disconnect, you can see it at the local level, you can see it at the continental level and at the global level. And I think in terms of, to your question of what needs to be done, in my opinion, I think there is an importance really of addressing the challenges that the smallholder farmers are being, are facing. There is value in, giving them a place on the table to discuss and understand the challenges that they are facing. There is also an importance of, targeting both the supply and the demand side, as it was, presented rightly in the first presentation. I think there's more that needs to be done across the whole chain. And lastly, I think really we need to be working to nourish people rather than feeding them, as it was highly highlighted. I think there's been more focus on, in the previous decades to, focus on production and food sufficiency, and putting aside the nutritious piece as a whole. And, time has come for a focus on nourishing populations rather than just feeding them. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Solomon. Xian, thoughts from you on kind of this localization of food systems, what's holding us back and what's really going to help us accelerate movement forward?
Sure. I think regarding to nutrition, I think local food, especially like CSA, we directly, just in 24 hours, we harvest the freshly produced vegetables and directly to the door. It certainly is, regarding to nutrition, it's we're nurturing the soil. So the good soil means good food. And also, for CSAs, we don't have any middle person. So directly from the farm to the table. And so so very few of middle process. That also means safety and security. So people, if we want to trace back what this kind of where, if something happened, if we want to trace back, it's easily to get to know where your food come from and who produced the food and where the problem happened. And I think something is happening just in Beijing just in recent 10 years, that we have fewer and fewer local farmers market, because in the downtown Beijing, some of our policymakers, they may think that farmers market means low end, or not clean, and it's not equals to the modern life. But on the other side, we increased more and more supermarket. Some also the chain stores in the city, but it also kind of longering the connection between the producers and the farmers. Even during the COVID, when it first happened, it's kind of the season of the strawberry season in Beijing, and most of the rural Beijing farmers who is producing strawberries is for the Spring Festival pickup. So people always come to the farm to pick up their own strawberries. But this year, no people can come to the rural areas, and all the strawberries are frost, are bad, going to bad in the field. But at the same time, how our government or local market can be very feasible, or can be very flexible, and also can be easily to kind of innovation ourselves, because all that farmers, they can't sell their strawberries on the online markets because they haven't tried to sell them before, and also they can't go to the downtown, to the street market, because as a farmer you are hard to easily to take your strawberry or any other produce to the community, to the where people are living, the living areas. But on the other side, people who is living in the center of Beijing, they are eager to get freshly food. So you can see what kind of barrier between the producer and the farmers and the consumers. I think firstly our policy, we need to renovate the institutions, and also the conventional opinions towards what is modern and what is tradition, especially in a history, in a kind of 5,000 years of history of farming country, how we can recognize ourselves, define our kind of identifications, and also for farmers, we also need to be organized, more organized, to adjustable.
Great. Thank you, Xian. I appreciate that. And Paula, final word quickly on the same question. Just, what are the obstacles? What are the real opportunities?
Yeah. Well, I've got 2 words for you: political will. So I think that part of what happened is that people understood the problems with farmers. They understood the problems with access, but they thought they could put a Band-Aid on what really is a broken bone. So it was a need to recognize the systemic aspect of the food system, which people are just now really beginning to understand. So before, they didn't feel it. So for many who were decision makers, it was very easy for them. They heard about these problems, but it didn't hit them at home. They were still able to go to Whole Foods and get local food. They had lots of farmers markets. They were able to eat and afford what they could purchase and eat well. So the problems were out there somewhere. So it's looking at what the solutions were didn't hit close enough to home, I think. But now with the impacts of COVID and the disruption in the supply chain, it's hitting home. So when you hear most people who can comfortably feed themselves well find that, oh gosh, I can't get flour now at my local market. Why? Well, think about it. Now the newspapers are revealing the headline, there isn't a local processing for farms or grain. It's become very centralized. What's the issue with the meat supply chain? Consolidated into 6 multinational corporations and only 50 food processing or meat processing plants in the United States, which had to shut down. So it brings home these issues of why a local system would be more resilient in times of crisis in particular, but for other reasons as well. So now that the attention has been highlighted on these issues, and they're seeing it and it's hitting home in a way, there's more conversation about needing to build a regionalized food system, and I'm glad of it.
Awesome. Thank you all, Paula, Solomon, Xian. That was fantastic. these are really inspiring examples of kind of holding a systems perspective, of really driving for change in both policy and practice and sort of the underlying enablers. You know, all of you approach your work built on a number of values and outcomes, not on singular metrics. And all of you are really involved very profoundly in the attempt to shift narratives and change paradigms, change the story. One of my favorite quotes on how to create change from Donella Meadows, who I often quote, who was both a brilliant systems thinker and communicator. She asked the question, how does change happen? And her answer was, in a nutshell, you keep pointing at the anomalies and failures in the old paradigm. You keep coming yourself and loudly and with assurance from the new one. You insert people with the new paradigm in places of public visibility and power. You don't waste time with reactionaries. Rather, you work with active change agents and with the vast middle ground of people who are open-minded. So I'm honored to be part of the session with some of these very active change agents, you know, from Corinna and Bill and Nancy to Solomon and Shiana and Paula, and of course the World Obesity Federation. You know, so thank you very much for including me in this. Please tune into our narrative. We also have coming to you more positive case studies and a guide to government policy, so stay tuned. And with that, I'll pass it back to Corinna.
Thank you, Ruth, and for chairing such a rich set of panelists. Wow, that was really incredible. I learned a lot there, and I'm sure many of our participants did as well. Thank you very much. I'm left just in a couple of things to add. I'm left with a couple of questions in my mind, having listened closely to the discussion today. And the question is, what food systems are going to produce the healthy food, the economic benefits to support livelihoods and to support sustainable environments, and as Solomon put it, to nourish people rather than just feed them? What do these food systems look like with these triple or quadruple wins, these co-benefits? And that's really a fundamental question of our time. And we've heard about what some of those food systems might look like. But from an obesity perspective, it's also important to ask the question, what does it say about how the kind of food systems that we have today that we actually need to reduce, we need less of? And how do we lessen that given the economic power structures in place today? So I think these are some really, really big questions that get to the fundamentals about our food economy and the need to shift to a healthier food economy. But there's some things that really came out strongly for me today. And the first was the importance of innovation, and that there's a tremendous amount of innovation in the food system that was talked about in all the presentations today, which can help create that kind of food system. The second is diversity, the clear need for a diversity of solutions and a diversity of food systems in bringing forward those solutions. And the third is about the importance of sharing, which is something that we've been doing today. The idea of bringing together people from very different perspectives, from different countries, from different cities, who spend their day jobs doing quite different things, and actually sharing ideas, sharing solutions, and connecting each other's problems in order to find solutions. So those things came across as really critical. The question remains still, the big question is how do we get it done? And as Ruth, you had a wonderful statement there about how does change happen? And a very insightful quote there from Donella Meadows. And I can't help think, having listened to the presentations and conversation today, of the importance of groundedness, of really trying to learn from what's going on the ground, and moving that up into the system, as opposed to relying on things that might sound big and grand, but actually might not be connected with reality. The importance of curiosity and learning as we go, that was also mentioned. The fact that we're trying out new things and we're learning as we go. We're not pretending that we have all the fancy answers at once. But on that journey, that we are thoughtful and we're reflective, and we think about our own roles and the roles of our organizations and ourselves, and whether what we're doing is being successful or not, and how we measure that. So to be thoughtful and reflective, and at the same time pushing forward, being with courage and decisiveness at the same time. In other words, I think what we need is quite a different type of leadership if we're really going to change food systems to address to address obesity and to address nutrition and to address all of these multiple benefits. And there's no time like now, in the wake of the catastrophic impacts of the coronavirus, to take this forward and to say, what does leadership really need to look like in order to make all of this happen? So let's hope that the UN Food Systems Summit, which will be next year, will take up all of these issues and think very deeply and seriously and how we can create these food systems for health and well-being for people and planet. So thank you very much again to the participants, to Nancy, Bill, Ruth, Paula, Solomon, Xian, and of course to the World Obesity Federation and the Global Alliance for the Future of Food for hosting this webinar today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to further conversations. Thank you.